What's going to happen to Europe? It's now much more than a financial crisis or a battle between the North and South. The big beasts of Europe, the French and the Germans, are drifting apart. The British are almost disengaged, and newer members like Poland are worried and apprehensive. Welcome to Agenda. I'm Colin Chapman, and like me, Stratfor's Reva Bhalla has just been in Europe. Reva, there's the 27-strong European Union run largely by elites, and within that there's the Eurozone, whose very existence is now in doubt. How do you see the interplay between these three concepts and the nations of Europe, many of whom have very different ideas as to the future?
Well, Colin, I came from Poland, and I was spending a lot of time with what you may call the European elite, right? A lot of the EU bureaucracy. And over again, I kept hearing about the number of meetings that were being held in search of this solution. And a line that I kept hearing about is, well, the European Union will remain united because it must remain united, and there must be a solution. And the alternative is just too scary to really imagine. So in my view, the conversation is still avoiding the really hard questions. So when you look at the fundamentals of the crisis, the unsustainable debt levels, the end of the growth era in many of these countries, and then you take a look at the disconnect between the generation in their 20s right now that are not finding the jobs that they're trained in, a whole generation lost in the periphery, and then the northern industrial states whose growth rates are maintaining themselves at pretty okay levels, you're seeing a very wide gap on the continent. And so then the issue of integration, which is really the central word that you hear on the continent, it means different things based on where you sit on the continent. So if you're in the periphery, integration means I'm going to get a steady flow of bailout funds. If you're in the north, if you're Germany, integration for you means you're going to have the oversight authority over countries' budgets and taxes to ensure that you're not endlessly bailing out this financial crisis to the point that it's going to come back to get you at home, and the politics are eventually going to catch up with you. And so that's where I think the European elite is struggling to ask itself, okay, what is the difference between Europe on the one hand and the European Union? I think it's maybe a bit delusional to think that the European Union will go back to once it was, but it doesn't mean that Europe just disappears altogether. You're going to have a regionalization effect take place, in which we're already seeing as that Eurozone core is dealing with that paradox of integration, but then you have those on the sidelines. If you look at the UK, if you look at the Baltic states, the Nordic states, the Central Europeans, who are watching what's going on, and they're not integrated into that core decision-making process anymore. And so more and more so, they're having to ask themselves, what are the benefits of remaining within this union? And that's a question that's going to become much more prominent with time as the crisis worsens.
I heard it said that for the Eurozone to survive, Germany would have to leave it and return to the mark. That seems unthinkable. But realistically, the Eurozone can't survive a two-speed Europe.
Germany is really the pivot to this crisis, because first thing we have to look at is how Germany's industrial capacity actually exceeds its domestic consumption. So it needs to maintain this market at all costs. And so when you see that sort of market and media speculation over when will Greece be ejected from the Eurozone and who's going to be next, it really fails to understand and internalize Germany's constraints when it needs to maintain the market for its own reasons. It needs to maintain the idea of a political union. And so it's ready to expend a great deal of resources to do that. Now, we've seen Germany, engage in very tough rhetoric when it comes to the conditions for bailouts, but eventually it always ends up giving in. And that's a trend that's going to continue until we start to see the local politics in Germany catch up to it. And we're just not quite there yet.
One problem with a fragmenting Europe is defence. There's been a half-hearted attempt within the European Union to have a serious discussion about a common defence policy, but it's gone nowhere. And it looks as if NATO will be the fulcrum. But there are many questions now about the future of NATO.
I think NATO suffers from many of the same ailments as the European Union does. It's an institution whose foundation is severely lacking. And so who is the common enemy? That is certainly up for debate. Also, NATO operations need the United States. I mean, we saw that example most recently with Libya, where NATO cannot really act independently, especially now with defense budgets being slashed left and right. And so that's why we're seeing alternative regional security formations develop. As states are seeking out other allies with common interests and are trying to look at the U.S. and gauge its reliability as a security guarantor, and if they can't rely fully on the United States, they're going to have to take matters into their own hands and try to think about their own defense in more independent terms. And I think that's something that Poland is starting to grapple with.
Yes, and of course, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Poland has put its faith in these two institutions, the EU and NATO, and now it wonders how reliable they are.
Yes, and so it may be time for Poland to start looking at alternatives, and most importantly, to start looking at itself, to see how it can develop itself to basically prepare for a much rougher neighborhood in its future. And this is something that, Poland understands its history very well. It understands that it's surrounded by two very big powers between Russia and Germany. And, defense policy is one part of that equation. But even economically, if you look at Poland, it's the 8th largest economy in the EU. It's the largest economy in Central Europe. They have a dynamism that the rest of the continent is severely lacking right now. They have a pretty strong demographic profile. And as large working class that's going to last them through the decade, and very big contrast to the rest of the continent, especially a major trading partner like Germany. And so you have, Poland in many ways benefited from not being good enough to join the Eurozone when it applied. Now it's been able to insulate itself from that market. It's definitely bracing itself for more negative news to come. But I think it has the ability to weather a lot of this crisis much better than many of its neighbors.
Reva Bhalla, who's just returned from Europe. That's Agenda for this week. Thanks for your company. Have a good weekend.